Paul did not instruct the churches to try to bring all the unbelievers. Let me ask another question. We can see that when the church came together, as one body, they partook of the Lord's Supper. One body, one bread, one cup. And they recognized the body in the ministry of spiritual gifts. Can you see the analogy there? One body and many members. We partake of one body. We are one body. God has given to all a measure of the grace of Christ. Now, maybe not everyone is an apostle. Maybe not everyone is a teacher. Maybe not everyone has a gift. But everybody has something. Something. And when you bring something together, something from God, from everybody, the body is able to grow, to edify, to be built up. Why? Because of Jesus. And because of allowing Jesus to be the head of the church. So, the analogy is very clear between the Lord's Supper and the body and the fullness of spiritual gifts distributed within the church for the building up of the body. And so, let me ask this. If we were supposed to invite all the believers, all the unbelievers to church, then let me ask, should the unbelievers also partake of the Lord's Supper? Should unbelievers drink of the cup? Is that not for God's people, the people of faith? And so, let's look at it on another level, because we actually have a type given by the Holy Spirit. How about when the people of God, the Israelites, were led out of the land of Egypt, and they partook of the Passover meal, and they marked the lintel of the door with blood, and the angel of death passed over their homes while the Egyptians were smitten. Was that Passover meal for everybody? Was the Passover meal for the unbelieving Egyptians? Did God say, invite all the unbelieving Egyptians to the Passover meal? Or was that for God's people, the people of faith, the children of Abraham who were coming out of slavery? Well, it's very clear. God instituted the Passover meal under the Old Covenant for the people of faith. He didn't say it's for everybody, the whole world. It's for the unbelievers. No, he didn't say that. So how about in church? How about at Corinth? Would the church come together and partake of the Lord's body simply to... Now think about this. If the Corinthian Christians were, some of them getting drunk and filling their stomach, well, what would happen if that was offered to the whole world? Hey, come to church. Come early and get drunk. Everybody's invited. Hey, come to church. Fill your stomach. It's free food. Everybody's invited. Of course everybody would come. A lot of people would come. And not because of Jesus. What I'm trying to do is to show that we, Protestants, have rolled everything into one bowl of wax. I'm not against evangelism. I'm all for it. But look, in the New Testament, the evangelists preached to people who were not saved. They preached to heathen. They preached to idol worshippers. They preached to people who needed to hear how to be saved. That's not what the church is for. That's not what the assembling of the church is for. That's not what it was for in the days of the apostles. So, Paul, he writes, if the whole church assembles together and all speak in tongues, and ungifted or unbelievers enter, which appears to be the exception and not the rule, will they not say that you're mad? But if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or an ungifted man enters, he's convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of his heart are disclosed. And so he will fall on his face and worship God, declaring that God is certainly among who? Among you. Well, among the Christians in the church of Corinth. Listen to this. But if all prophesy, and an unbeliever or an ungifted man enters, he's convicted by all. He's called into account by all. The secrets of his heart are revealed, and so he will fall on his face and worship God, declaring that God is certainly among you. Let's ask a question. Is this because of the presence of an apostle? No. Is this because of the presence of a prophet? No. Is this because of the presence of a teacher? No. A fivefold minister? No. This is the result of the proper administration of the spiritual gifts in and through the church, the body, under the headship of Jesus, the Lord. You can't say you didn't know, because you are hearing it today. So Paul writes, what is the outcome then, brothers? When you assemble, each one has a song, and each one has a teaching, and each one has a revelation, and each one has the tongue, and each one has an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification. What is he saying? That when the church assembles together, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, each one has something to contribute. A song, a hymn, a revelation, a teaching. And he says, let it be done for the edification of what? The church. And Paul says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by 2 or at the most 3, and each in turn. And one must interpret. The key here is in turn. Paul says, let all things be done for edification, and he says that they should speak in turn. In other words, taking turns, or one by one. And Paul says, but if there is no interpreter, he must keep silent in the church. What's the context? Obviously it's in the church. And what Paul is implying here, when he says, if there is no interpreter, then he must keep... What Paul is implying is that in the church of the apostles, people knew who had which gift. Otherwise, it would not be possible to utter a tongue and know that an interpreter is present if the person didn't know who is the interpreter. Think about it. You couldn't follow Paul's instructions here if you didn't know who was the interpreter, which means that they would have had to have known who had what gift. Don't say you never heard. You hear today. And so Paul says, let Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. In other words, in this context, when Paul says prophets, Paul's referring to inspired speakers. Let 2 or 3 inspired speakers speak, and let the others pass judgment. In other words, there has to be some control, because people could end up saying things that, well, it could be them or it could be some other spirit. So there has to be a measure of control. It can't just be a free-for-all. Now that control should be in place. Why? So the church can be edified. See, a lot of people, they don't, whoa, you want to control. Wait a minute. The point is to edify the church. So it cannot be anything goes. It cannot be anything goes and everyone yelling in tongues. It cannot be anything goes in inordinate amounts of messages in tongues but no interpretation. It cannot be anything goes in as far as people just say anything that maybe isn't scriptural or isn't from God. So there has to be some control. And now Paul goes on to write, but if a revelation is made to another who is seated. Remember, I asked in the beginning, I asked you about Agabus in the 11th chapter of the book of Acts. You remember that? Remember, I asked this question. Luke, writing, says, one of them named Agabus stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine over the whole world. One of them named, actually, Luke wrote, now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. So you see, a group of prophets moved from Jerusalem over to Antioch. One of them named Agabus stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit. Why did Luke write Agabus stood up and began to indicate? I'm sure you remember this question from the very beginning. Well, here, Paul says, he explains, but if a revelation is made to another who is seated, remember, Luke said Agabus stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit the famine that was going to come. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated. Now before this, Paul says they're to speak in turn. 2 or 3 at the most in turn. And here he says, if a revelation is made to another who's seated. This implies that some people are seated and some are standing. And it implies that ones who are seated are waiting for revelation from the Holy Spirit. And ones who stand up, like Agabus, they have a revelation from the Holy Spirit.